In this video I'm going to be discussing some STIC metering block setup and tuning tips.
Whoa, that's sharp then. Wow.
If you purchased a complete Keihin and STIC carb kit from Tokyo Off-Road, then it's already been set up, and you can skip to the end of this video and watch the tuning tips if you like. However, you might find the setup tips useful if you need to overhaul the carb at some time. Okay, I'll get started with the setup tips. If you're installing a new stick in a carb you already have, one good thing to check is what tube is installed in the stick. If you purchase one from Tokyo Off-Road, currently I supply all the sticks with a 114 emulsification tube, but it's still a good idea to check what's inside, so I'll show you how to check that. To remove the tube, the first thing you need to do is take out the safety screw, and this is a Torx 15 head, so you can just loosen it or take it right out, doesn't matter. And then the next step is to loosen the main jet one turn. So you need a 6mm bit and just loosen it one turn. Then you can flip it upside down, and using some force, this one comes out relatively easy, press down on the main jet and you can see the tube lifting up, and you can wind it out a bit more and press it out. Then once you have it out a little way, you should be able to pull it out. And on the side of the emulsification tube, there's some numbers, and the first two numbers refer to the size of the tube. So this one says 14, which refers to a 114 size. Also available is a 115 size, which is slightly larger. When you reinstall the tube, make sure you get the orientation correct. One easy check to make is where the safety screw sits on the tube, there's a flat. So there's only a flat on one place. So you can orientate that easily when you look at the stick. So just slide it in and push down firmly. And make sure it slides in. Definitely don't force it if it's not going in. And then you can flip it over and start the main jet. And then you want to tighten the main jet. Make sure you don't over tighten it. It needs to be snug, but you don't really need to crank down on it hard. And then once you've tightened the main jet, you can install the safety screw. Okay, so that's reassembled now and ready for installation into the carburetor. Okay, so now we can get the carb ready for installation of the stick. As you can see, I've already taken out the original block, which looks like that. And the block is held in place in 2 points with 2 bolts, here and here. And thread lock is used originally. So it's a good idea to clean out the thread lock from the threads. So you can either use a thread chaser or a tap carefully. I made this thread chaser myself, so I ground this into a M4 0.7 pitch bolt. And this does a really good job of clearing out the threads without damaging them. So you can start it and then just wind it in. And it only takes a few seconds, but definitely worth doing. If you don't clean them out, you'll find that the new bolts can bind, and it can be difficult to tighten them properly. So highly recommend cleaning out the threads before you do the install. Okay, so after you've used the thread chaser or tap, use some compressed air to blow out the debris. And you want to clean out the base area there where the gasket sits as well. And also inside the fuel valve. Okay, so now we're ready to install the stick, and the stick has a gasket round it, and you want to make sure that's pressed down firmly, and that all looks good. And you also want to make sure there's no debris. and that looks no problem at all. So then you can go ahead and install it into the carburetor, and you want to press it down and make sure it's seated correctly, and that looks good. And then get your new screws. So the stick is supplied with screws with thread lock pre-applied, so you can use those. If you're refitting a stick, you can apply some new thread lock. I recommend using Loctite 243 medium strength. And these screws, they have a head which is a Torx 20, and the stick is supplied with both Torx 15 and 20 bits, so you can fully overhaul the stick with the supplied bits. And these are M4 bolts, so you want to be careful that you don't over torque them because they're not that large, but you do want them seated firmly. Okay, so that looks good, and a couple of checks you want to make. One is the gap between you want to make sure there's no gap between the carb body and the stick here, and that looks good, and also around this one as well, and that looks good as well. And then you can look inside the bore of the carburetor. It's probably easier looking this way, and make sure that the bore lines up with the stick in this area, and there's not a step, so that looks good as well. So you can confirm the stick is installed correctly by those checks. Okay, so now's a good time to check what jets you have installed. So the main jet is easy enough. You can see on the side of the jet, and that's a 190, which is good. And the idle jet is down here in this passageway, and the internal diameter is 5 millimeters. So you need a screwdriver with a blade width which is slightly less than 5 millimeters. So I use this one and unscrew the pilot jet fully, and then you can just flip the carb upside down and it drops out. And I want to check the size, and it's marked on the side, so you can see that's a 50, which is correct. And you might notice that I've applied some anti-seize on the threads. You don't need much, but it's a good idea to either use some anti-seize or some oil so it doesn't seize up. And then I'm going to reinstall it. So I know my jets are now 50 pilot and 190 main jet. And the thread for the pilot jet inside the stick is slightly tapered. So especially when it's new, you'll find it's quite stiff. So I like to tighten it and then release it, tighten 3 times before fully tightening it. Be careful not to over torque it, but you do want to seat the pilot jet down securely. Okay, so now we're ready to install the float, and before you do, check down inside the float valve, make sure there's no debris. I've already blown out inside there, so that looks good. And also check the float needle valve, and it has a rubber part here which can deteriorate over time. So check that. If it doesn't look good, definitely replace it. If it's damaged at all, it'll leak and you won't be able to set the level correctly. So once you've checked that and everything looks good, you can install the float. Do this carefully because there are small parts which are easily damaged. And then the float is held in place with a pin. So you just thread the pin through. And once you've installed the float, check that it moves freely. So that looks good. And you also want to set the float level accurately. So I actually made a float height and adjustment video recently, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. The reason that you want to set the float level accurately is because if it's too high or too low, the carburetor won't operate correctly. For example, if the float level is too high, the carburetor will tend to run rich. The reason being the fuel level is high, and less differential pressure is required to lift the fuel up through the tube. And conversely, if the float level is low and the fuel level is low, the carburetor will tend to run lean because the fuel level is lean and more differential pressure is required to lift the fuel up through the tube. So it's very important to check the float level, and definitely recommend watching the video if you're unsure about how to do it. Okay, so once you've checked and adjusted the float height, you're ready to put the rest of the carburetor back. So you can put the float bowl back on once you've cleaned off the surfaces, and also you're ready to reinstall the slide and needle. And before you run the bike for the first time with this stick, it's a good idea to fit a new spark plug. Really two reasons. One is to rule out any issues there might be with an old spark plug. And two, you can look at the color of the plug and get a rough idea of how well the bike is running, whether it's running too rich or too lean. I typically don't go too much on the plug color. I rely more on how the bike feels and sounds, but that is one indication that you can use. The recommended baseline settings for KTM and Husky 250 and 300s, running a Keihin PWK38 Airstriker short with a stick, are a pilot of 50, main jet 190. The needle is a N3 EJ on the third clip, the slide is 6.5, and the air screw 3 turns out. We previously recommended a 182 main jet, but found that some bikes would run rich down low at idle and small throttle openings. The root cause of the problem turned out to be the gap between the main jets and needle is small and a siphon is created. And increasing the main jet size breaks the siphon and cleans up the bottom. So we've done a lot of testing recently on both 250s and 300s and found that all bikes operate very well with a 50 pilot jet and a 190 main jet. So going forwards, we're going to be recommending these settings.
I thought my bike was perfect when it was running a bit rich, but we were fouling spark plugs a bit, and just put a 50 pilot jet in, and I can't imagine anything going as good as this. That was a third gear pull going up there.
Okay, so if we pretend this carburetor is installed on bike and everything is connected, the first check you want to make is the air screw setting. So when I ship bikes, I always set them to 3 turns out now, but you should check that anyway. So I'm going to start by turning in fully and then count 3 turns out. Okay, so that's 3 turns out. Next, you can do a test start. So you want to turn on the fuel. If it's cold, pull on the choke, and then you can start the bike. And once it's started and running smoothly, push in the choke, and then you probably need to adjust the throttle. So if the idle is too low, you want to screw in the idle. So it's quite difficult to do by hand, so have a screwdriver handy, and if it's too low you want to turn it clockwise, so like that. If it's too high, anti-clockwise. So adjust the idle position initially, and then you want to allow the bike to warm up. So if you can ride it, get it up to temperature and then set the idle again. Once the bike has come up to temperature, I recommend riding it for at least 1 hour before making any major changes. The reason being is you want to get a good feel for how the bike is riding, and also depending on what setup you had before, especially if it was running rich, it needs some time to clear out. If you feel it's lean bogging, the easiest change to make is the air screw. So you can try turning in 1/4 of a turn at a time and retest. Other things you could try are a richer needle, or you could adjust the needle position. So drop the clip down a position to richen up the needle. Or you could try a larger main jet or a larger stick tube. Or if you find it running rich on the bottom, the first check you should make is the choke isn't engaged. And if that's not a problem, the easiest change to make is the air screw. So you can open up the air screw a quarter of a turn at a time and lean it out and retest. Common settings for the air screw are between 3 and 3.5 turns out. You can go 4 turns out maximum. You should also check what pilot and main jet sizes you're using. As I described earlier, sometimes using a smaller main jet can cause a siphon issue between the main jet and the needle at closed throttle positions. So going up to a larger size main jet can resolve this issue. Once you have the carburetor with the stick set up correctly, you should find that the power is much stronger than before, and also the power increases in a linear manner from bottom to top without any sudden spikes or peaks. This makes it really easy to control the power with the throttle and dial in exactly how much you want. And it should feel responsive with no bogging, and it shouldn't load up either. And another big advantage of the stick is it performs very consistently from right to right, and also different elevations, and also over weather changes. If you have any tuning issues which you can't resolve yourself, feel free to contact me at Tokyo Off-Road or STIC headquarters.